Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tiqets Culture Festival. I'm Rachel. I'll be hosting today's session. I work at Tiqets. We're so glad to welcome so many of you, over 100 already, from all corners of the world. Feel free to continue to put where you're joining us from in the chat to experience culture from home, but not alone this week together. And we're so pleased to have joining us now the staff at Windsor Castle to explain more about the castle to all of you. And I'll pass it over to Richard Williams, who is the learning curator for Windsor Castle. He's about to give us some background on Windsor Castle, which is, of course, residence of Her Majesty The Queen. It has also been the home of British royal history for nearly 1,000 years. So I can't wait to hear from Richard a little bit more about the building, because he, believe me, is a pro. So Richard, if you'd like to unmute yourself and introduce yourself to the audience.
Right, well, welcome to this virtual visit to Windsor Castle. Like Buckingham Palace, Windsor is an official residence of Her Majesty the Queen, and so as an international stage for great events in British national life and the spectacle and pomp of royal ceremonies. This includes state visits with guards of honour to welcome heads of foreign countries, and also arrivals by carriage procession down the 2.5-mile avenue, tree-lined avenue called the Long Walk, created in the 17th century to link the castle with the Windsor Great Park, and you can see it stretching out there. Receptions and state banquets take place in the state apartments, the magnificent state apartments at the castle, and it is also here where the Queen awards knighthoods, damehoods, and a range of other honours to people from all walks of life. But Windsor is a royal palace within a medieval castle, and a castle that still retains its military garrison, for example, retains its royal chapel, where generations of the royal family have been baptized, buried, and also married, famously in 2018 with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. The chapel is also the spiritual home to the highest order of chivalry in England, the Knights of the Garter, the Order of the Garter, of which the Queen is sovereign, as you can see in the image here. And not only all that, the staterooms of the castle are a showcase for highlights from one of the greatest art collections in the world, the Royal Collection, and we'll be looking at a few examples of that when we move inside. So Windsor is all of these things, and that's what makes it unique. But it also has a very personal significance for Her Majesty the Queen, and has been since she was a young child. As a young princess during the Second World War, the Queen was based within the safety of Windsor Castle. And in our current national crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, the Queen, along with the Duke of Edinburgh, is here at Windsor Castle as her base. And in fact, you may already have seen the photo I'm showing you on screen that was issued just last week of the Queen doing her daily horse ride on one of her favourite ponies in the beautiful grounds of Windsor, which she does every day. So although the castle is closed at the moment, we're very keen to welcome visitors back as soon as we're told it's safe to do so. Because the castle usually is open all year round, and visitors are welcomed by a team of wardens, such as my friend on the screen I'm showing you here, who will help to show you around, share their knowledge and enthusiasm to introduce you to everything that the castle has to offer. And talking of introductions, I suppose I really ought to introduce who and what I am. So my official title is Dr. Richard Williams, Learning Curator for Royal Collection Trust, but please just call me Richard. My background is that for many years I was an academic historian in a university department, but 7 years ago this amazing opportunity came to come and work at Windsor Castle, which I simply couldn't resist. And so I oversee everything to do with education. I organise academic conferences and really try to promote to the public all the latest research into the history of the castle and its amazing collections. So, of course, I would very strongly recommend that you come and visit if you've not already been. The castle itself is in the beautiful countryside of Berkshire, but it's very, very close to London. In fact, when it was originally built in the Middle Ages, it was said to have been deliberately positioned within a one-day march from London. But if marching isn't really your thing, you can drive from London very easily, and the train takes, it's barely half an hour, so it's a very, very easy journey if you want to come and pay a visit. But Windsor is believed to be the oldest and largest inhabited castle in the world. Kings and queens have lived here for over 900 years, and so we can describe it as the home of British royal history. And I always think what makes this castle so instantly recognisable compared to other castles in the UK is firstly this round tower which you see at the centre of the screen here. But notice that it has a turret on top for the flagpole. And this flag turret is not dead centre, but is off to the side. And what this does is it creates this unique silhouette, this unmistakable outline that's visible right across from the countryside, or as in this case, the view from the town of Windsor that has grown up around the castle for many hundreds of years. But to get a sense of just how vast the castle is, it helps to look at it from up above. So if we go high up like this, if you notice that the castle begins in the very, very far left of the screen, right to the far right. It really is on a vast scale. But the best way to think of the castle and understand it is that it's in three parts, three courtyards, or wards, to use the technical term for a castle. So we have on the left, if I use my pointer, hopefully you can see, this is the lower ward, and that's dominated by this building here, St. George's Chapel. Then there's a middle ward, and that's dominated by the round tower on its huge mound of earth. And then thirdly, we have the upper ward, and that's where the state apartments are, and also the private apartments where the Queen and members of the royal family live. So if we just go back to the lower ward, we don't just have the chapel, but along the wall here on the inside, that is the Garrison, the barracks building, where the soldiers who guard the Queen are positioned. Different regiments come to do this duty on a changing basis, and they perform a changing of the guard ceremony, exactly as happens in Buckingham Palace. And I can actually show you a clip of this. Right, here we are back again. So just up from the barracks we looked at is St. George's Chapel itself, one of the most important ecclesiastical buildings really in the world. And when you go inside it, it's really astonishing. I mean, it's more like a cathedral than a chapel. It's great soaring height with these spectacular fan-vaulted ornaments on the ceiling. It's a royal chapel, so a burial place for 39 monarchs, including Henry VIII. But it's also home to a religious community. So Windsor has many communities, a military one, a religious one. So we have choir boys, choristers, priests, canons, organists, all living in a series of buildings, medieval buildings, surrounding the main chapel building itself. But it's also a royal chapel, and the Queen does attend services here. It tends to be the more ceremonial ones or family ones. But when she does worship, she would sit in the seat I'm showing you on the screen on the left of the door there. This is the sovereign's stall, carved in English oak in the 1470s. So looking at the view from the west side, there's the chapel, and we're looking up to the round tower on its huge mound of earth. This is the oldest part of the castle. And to think about the very earliest years of the castle itself, why it was created, you really need to realize why it was created there at all. And the clue to that is on the left of your screen. Can you see there is the River Thames? Because the first castle on this site was built around the year 1070 by William the Conqueror. And we think it was to protect a river crossing, so a bridge over the river. The river is the River Thames, and so that's the route directly back to London. But this original castle is very different from what you see now. It would have been very basic, just a mound of earth with a wooden fort on top of it. And we've recently had a computer-generated image made that really gives a sense of what it probably looked like back then. And if I show you that on screen now, you can see how very, very different it is. So really very basic indeed, a Motte and Bailey castle as it's called. So the big mound of chalky earth with a simple fort on top of it. And so its subsequent history after this 1070 date was that the lower ward was added on one side, then the upper ward on the other side, and the lot was rebuilt in stone. But from that medieval date, the outline of the castle hasn't really changed. But if you go back to how it looks today, just about everything else has. The one thing that survives from that very, very earliest castle is that chalky mound of earth, because the round tower may have changed, but that is exactly the same mound of earth that was put there 1,000 years ago. So it's a good example of the amazing historical continuity that this place has. And I can show you another example of that if we move within the walls of the castle now. So there is St. George's Chapel on the left, but look at the buildings on the right as we go by them. These are all little individual houses. And this is where the military knights of Windsor live, formerly called the Poor Knights. And this is a group that dates right back to the reign of King Edward III in 1348, who decided that military men who'd come to the end of their career, if they didn't have a family that could look after them in old age or didn't have money of their own, the king would provide them with houses for the rest of their life. And all he asked in return was that they say prayers for the king and for the Knights of the Garter. And that's a tradition that's kept alive in an unbroken chain since 1348 to the present day. So there are many things that simply haven't changed in hundreds and hundreds of years. Other parts of the castle, though, have adapted and evolved from one reign to the next. And a good example of that is going back to the round tower yet again. That's how you will see it today. But for the first 700 years of its life, it would have looked like this. So what I'm showing you here is a watercolor made at the end of the 18th century. And notice how short and squat the round tower actually looks. This was to change after 1820, when King George IV came to the throne, and he spent vast sums of money completely transforming Windsor Castle, both inside and out. And he is the person who basically transforms it into the romantic ideal of what a medieval castle ought to look like. So he thought that tower was nowhere near medieval enough, and so he doubled it in height. And I can show you that by superimposing a modern photo. Well, I was just describing this 18th century view of the Round Tower, and how it really exemplifies how it was dramatically altered by King George IV. So King George IV comes to the throne in 1820 and spends vast sums of money completely transforming the castle both inside and out. And it's really down to him that Windsor has the appearance of the romantic ideal of what a castle ought to look like. So he thought that the tower, as it had looked for several hundred years, just wasn't impressive or medieval looking enough, and so he doubled its height. And so what I can do is show you a modern photograph from the same vantage point as this 18th century watercolor, and just look how much more dramatic that tower now is. There's a horizontal line about halfway up called the string course, and that effectively marks where the height of the castle used to be for 700 years before it was dramatically heightened. So we move then with the round tower on the left into the upper ward. And as I said, this is where the state apartments are housed. They're on the left of the courtyard, and also where the private apartments of the Queen and other members of the royal family are as well. The courtyard itself, we call it the Quadrangle, and it's also the site for important royal events. And in fact, there is going to be one here on Saturday, this coming Saturday morning, because Saturday is the official birthday of Her Majesty the Queen. And traditionally on this day in London, there is a military parade called Trooping the Colour. But because of the current situation, we can't have a great big, huge outdoor parade like that. So a version of it, a birthday parade, is going to take place at Windsor Castle this year. And it will be broadcast on BBC television, so you may be able to catch that if you're interested. And it's taking place in this exact spot in the Quadrangle of Windsor Castle. So I've taken us on a very brief spin looking at the exterior. Now let's go inside towards the state apartments. So you come down this wonderful entry hall, the inner hall. This is another thing added by King George IV in the 1820s. You go around the corner, are surrounded by armor, displays of weapons and swords, up the grand staircase, and then on the first floor, you're in the state apartments. And the state apartments effectively fall into two natural halves. One half is the part that was totally transformed by George IV, again in the 19th century. And there you see vast, huge entertainment rooms. So these are rooms that are intended for entertainment on a grand scale. So balls with people dancing, hundreds of people dancing at a time, or banquets with a huge number of guests. Whereas the other half of the state apartments, and I'm showing you an image from one of the rooms in that bit. These are the rooms that were completely adapted in the 17th century by Charles II. And in that period, it's quite different from the 19th century. It's all about being exclusive. So you don't want huge numbers of people. The rooms get smaller and smaller and smaller the closer you get to the king. So it's all about having VIP areas, if you like. It's making it as intimate and as exclusive as possible, but no less extravagant in its decoration. You can see this is a typical 17th century Baroque interior. We have an elaborately painted ceiling with gods and goddesses and Charles II's Queen, Catherine of Braganza, up in the heavens, tapestries on the wall, paneling, and also above the fireplace, there's this beautiful hand-carved wooden ornament by the famous Grinling Gibbons, who was one of the greatest carvers of the age. But because these 17th century rooms are on this more intimate scale, they're the ideal location to show off many of the great masterpieces from the royal collection. So I mentioned the Royal Collection, one of the greatest art collections in the world. It's on a vast scale. It also is incredibly diverse. I mean, it includes paintings, sculptures, furniture, tapestries, manuscripts, books, coins, medals, coaches, the crown jewels. I mean, it is absolutely extraordinary. It is owned by the Queen in trust for her successors and the nation. And I'm a part of Royal Collection Trust. And what our job is to look after this amazing collection of art and to make as much of it available and interesting to as many members of the public as we possibly can. Now, I can't exactly show you 1.25 million works of art, which is what is in the Royal Collection, but I could show you one. Well, perhaps one or two. And I've just chosen this because it's a particular favourite of mine. This is a Northern Renaissance painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, the massacre, the biblical story of the massacre of the innocents, the story of King Herod ordering the killing of all the newly born male children. But what's so fascinating about this painting is when you look up close, and if I just point out on the left side here, there is one of the mothers weeping and wailing, wringing her hands, but she's crying over not a dead child, but what looks like a pork pie and a string of sausages. So what on earth, you may be asking, is going on there? Well, I can show you another video clip, again, if you'll bear with me, of a colleague of mine who is the head of paintings conservation, Nicola Christie.
The painting was painted by Peter Bruegel the Elder, who was an early Netherlandish artist working in the Low Countries, and we know that in 1621 it was described as the plundering of a village, not the massacre of the innocents. So we know that it was overpainted at a very early stage in its history, which is very unusual. When you start looking closely, you see that sinister things are going on. For example, this group in the lower centre here, you can see a man with a sharp dagger, and he's holding by the ear a bullock, and a lady to his right is remonstrating with him, pleading with him to stop. Now, if you look more closely at the bullock, you can see a small child's feet protruding from beneath it. The child was covered up by the bullock, again, to make it a less distressing image. The reason that you can see the children emerging from beneath the animals now is for a number of reasons. The painting, we know, was cleaned in around the 1940s, but they didn't take off this very, very early overpaint, possibly because it was quite difficult to do. But as the oil paint ages, it becomes more transparent, and the layers beneath begin to show through. This is quite a natural feature of oil paint, but in this particular instance, we can see rather clearly now what is happening underneath.
So if you're interested in that painting, or indeed any work of art on display at Windsor Castle, or anywhere where we're showing the Royal Collection, you can find up lots of information on our website. It's rct.uk, and it has an Explore the Collection section. And in the box on the right side here, I've just entered Peter Bruegel. And when you do a search on that, up comes the painting we've just been looking at. Underneath it tells you it's in the King's Closet in Windsor Castle. And then up comes an image. You can download a big high definition image of it free of charge, with a full description taken from one of the exhibition catalogues, further information, and then it shows you where you can see it in other exhibitions and other areas of display. So well worth a look if you're interested. So that was a quick look into the 17th century part of the state apartments. If we now look to those huge rooms from the 19th century, what you see on screen is a good example of that, the Waterloo Chamber, one of the biggest in the collection. And again, if you go to the website, you can actually have a full 360-degree look around it. So if I just demonstrate that, sorry if it sort of lags a bit on screen, but by using the arrow keys at the bottom, you can have a look around this room. There is the huge state banquet table in the center. Then we can look upwards at this magnificent ceiling with 5 chandeliers. This space was originally a medieval courtyard open to the air. And what happened in the 19th century was this roof was simply covering it over to create this completely new, huge room called the Waterloo Chamber. And it's called the Waterloo Chamber after the paintings that it was intended to display. These are portraits of important figures from all over Europe who were instrumental in the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. But there's one very intriguing thing, that many of these portraits are harboring a secret lurking beneath them, because during the Second World War, the portraits were removed for safekeeping. And at the time, the young Princess Elizabeth and her sister Margaret loved putting on pantomime performances, but they thought this room looked a bit dull, not having any paintings in it. So they asked a local art student to paint pictures of pantomime characters. And what's so fascinating is that those pantomime characters are still there beneath these very somber, formal portraits. So, for example, beneath King George III, who you see here, painted by Sir Thomas Lawrence over the fireplace, beneath him is Aladdin and his lamp, would you believe? And it's wonderful to see the different ones and who they're paired with. There's Puss in Boots, Old Mother Hubbard, and the list goes on. But it's wonderful that they're still there after all this time. So moving from the Waterloo Chamber next door to St. George's Hall, this was the original medieval hall. It is where state banquets take place. So there is the state banquet table, but extended to its full extent, which sits 169 people. It really is pretty spectacular. And if you look about halfway up on the right side, can you see there are two cushions? So one of those would be for where the Queen sits, with the visiting head of state sitting next to her. But the remarkable thing about what you see in St. George's Hall is that most of it dates to the 1990s. And the reason for this is that this is one of the rooms devastated by the terrible fire that broke out at Windsor Castle back in 1992. It only broke out in the northeast corner of the castle, but did enough damage. About 9 important staterooms were really horribly destroyed by it. And I can show you a photograph of what the fire did to St. George's Hall here. And you can see how dramatic it is. I mean, it completely gutted it, so that the roof went, really just the walls and a few other features remained intact. And when this happened, a colleague of mine called Gary Wilson, who's one of the senior conservators, he was actually working at Windsor at the time, and it's fascinating to hear his eyewitness account. So I'll just switch over and show you a short clip of that.
We went into the Waterloo Chamber, where the state banquet table is, which consists of 13 huge beds, 8x4 sheets, which was then individually carried out down the stairs, out into the quadrangle. We came back in, the carpet was rolled up, so we lifted that up, carried that out, and that took 50, 60 people to do. And then by this time, more people had come, and they were removing the books from the Royal Library. They were packing them into boxes, taking them out the window onto the side door, across the side door roof, and handing them down to people. The people themselves were very calm. They realised there was a job to be done, and everybody mucked in. We were quite emotional about the fire itself, but then also when the building was put back and the reinstating of all the furniture that we'd taken out, and the public reaction to what they saw when they came in, and when they saw it, how much they thought what a wonderful job had been done for all these craftsmen, which are all around the country. It wasn't just one group, it was a countrywide effort by people of many different skills to get this back to as it was.
So St George's Hall then is one of those rooms that, as we saw, was wonderfully restored, but not exactly to how it used to look. This is very much a modern interpretation of the medieval style, but still using the traditional craft techniques. But some of the other rooms that were terribly damaged, like this one, the Grand Reception Room, this was historically recreated exactly as it looked. And when you see just what a job they did, it truly is spectacular. Acres of gold leaf is what you can see there. So that's exactly as it looked before the fire took place. But Windsor hasn't stood still. It's never stood still. We're currently redisplaying many of the works of art in the state apartments at the castle. The display cases I'm showing you on screen here have got a wonderful new display of objects from all over the world, many of them given as gifts to the Queen. But among the extraordinary treasures at Windsor Castle, one of the most popular among visitors is this, Queen Mary's Doll's House. And I will finish by showing you a brief video all about that.
I'm standing in front of Queen Mary's Doll's House, which is for many people one of their favourite objects when they come to visit Windsor Castle. It was actually made in 1921 for Queen Mary as a gift from the nation. The Doll's House was designed by Sir Edward Lutyens, who was one of the most eminent architects of the day. After the First World War, I think the committee were very aware of the fact that life was transient and they wanted to create a record of Edwardian England, and this is very much what they've achieved with the house. It went on display for the first time in 1924, and a year later it was transferred to Windsor Castle, and it's been here ever since, so it's been on display for more than 90 years. That's one of the reasons we are now undertaking a conservation project to survey how the Doll's House has stood up over the test of time.
Each morning we've been coming in with a tray to the Doll's House and taking out one room at a time.
The room we're looking at the moment is the King's bedroom. The main challenge is the tiny scale of the items. Some of them, of course, are very fiddly to pick up, so we use a pair of tweezers often to pick them up and remove them from the house. We then look at the objects individually, very carefully check them against our computerised database and make sure that what we think is in that room tallies up with what we actually have in front of us. We then very lightly dust the objects and condition check them, so look at them very carefully, and we record their condition again on our computerised database.
It's one of the joys of working with this sort of collection that we get to see inside these tiny little things, and some of them are absolutely minuscule.
If any works need conservation, we place them on a separate table and the conservator will come in and check those items and do any remedial work which needs to be done.
So sorry if there was an issue with the playback there. But if essentially that's it then, we've come to the end of this flying visit to Windsor Castle. What I've been able to show you is just a tiny fraction of what we have here, but I hope that perhaps you will be able to come and visit yourself and manage to see everything that that makes Windsor so special. So I think now we have some questions, is that right?
Yes, we've had a number of questions coming in throughout the session. Please do feel free to continue using that Slido link in the chat to ask your questions. You can also vote on your favorite questions, even if you don't have one of your own. That's how we'll make sure we get to the best ones. So the top rated question right now, someone's asking you, Richard, specifically, what is your favorite room in Windsor Castle and why?
Oh, that's a really, really difficult one. I think, well, my current one, it does change, I suppose. My current one isn't actually one of the ones I showed you, but it's in that 17th century part. It's called the King's Dining Room. and it's surrounded by carvings of different kinds of foods and fruits and vegetables, with a painted ceiling of the gods having a banquet. But what fascinates me about it is it's got two sort of recesses, and we know that musicians played music there. So when the king and queen were eating, musicians were playing in these special little music rooms to either side, in what may have been some kind of stereo, a 17th century stereo effect. And that's something that I invited musicians from the Royal College of Music students to come in and recreate that. And we did that in February, and it sounded absolutely amazing. The music filled the whole room from these special little rooms for musicians. So I think probably that one at the moment.
That sounds like a magical experience. Another question, someone wants to know if there are kings buried in the St. George's Chapel.
If there are what, kings?
Kings, yes.
Yes, many kings are buried there. So Henry VIII, famously with the 6 wives, he's buried there. In fact, when you go into the choir of the chapel, there is a big sort of plaque on the floor, and it says here is where Henry VIII and his favourite queen, Jane Seymour, were buried. Also, Charles I, the king who was famously executed in the 17th century, he was taken back and buried in St. George's Chapel. 39 monarchs in all have been buried there. And I suppose in more recent years, the Queen's father has buried there, and her mother and her sister. So it does have a very particular significance for the Queen. But no, it's one of the major important royal burial chapels in the country.
And another personal question, someone says your job is amazing and that it's great to hear the passion in your voice. They say you're very lucky. They're asking, what's your most treasured memory of your job?
Oh no, that's terrible. There's just too many. I think one of the strangest was I had done an evening event. We'd had sort of lectures and taken people around the castle, and somebody asked me, "Are you all right to close up?" And so I walked around the state apartments of Windsor Castle, turning off the lights and closing the door. And then I had to lock the door. I thought that the responsibility of me locking the door to this building with an enormously long Harry Potter-esque key. I mean, it is guarded by police and it's totally secure, but it was just the astonishing experience of that. It's a bit like going out in the evening and you turn the lights out and lock the door. Well, I did that in a 1,000-year-old castle, which is really quite something.
That does sound like quite the responsibility. Another question, have any film scenes been set at Windsor Castle?
The answer to that is no, none, ever, and never will be, because none of the royal palaces where the Queen is in residence, they never, ever give permission for film crews, television crews to film there. So what often happens is that there are other buildings in the country that look very similar. They may be of a similar date with the sort of 19th century interiors. And so there are a few go-to buildings where filming takes place, but they're never actually the real thing. So you will never have seen Windsor Castle in a film. You've really got to come and see it for yourself.
That's great. Someone else wants to know if the castle has a prison.
It does. It has a dungeon. It's in the part where St. George's Chapel is. There's a tower called the Curfew Tower. It's basically the bell tower. But right in the basement of that is what's called the dungeon. And it's where soldiers in the 17th century in the English Civil War were placed. Also in the big stone gate tower entrance called Henry VIII Gate, that for a brief moment in the 18th century was a debtor's prison. So if you couldn't pay your debts, you were thrown into that sort of temporary jail until you were bailed out by your family and friends. So I can't remember when the last time someone would have been imprisoned in Windsor Castle. Probably it was in the 17th century in the English Civil War. But it's not the kind of dungeon that you see in horror films with shackles on the wall, that kind of thing. No, it's a bit more civilized than that.
Great. A couple questions that came in about the fire that we discussed. So one person asked, has it all been fully restored now after the fire? Another person asked, when did the fire happen? A reminder on that. Yes, those are the two fire questions.
Okay, well, it broke out in November 1992. We think the cause was a faulty lamp coming into contact with a curtain, and it basically ignited it. And because of the ancient structure of the castle, the fire just spread. You just couldn't stop it. And so, it caused a huge amount of damage in that particular part of the castle. The restoration project was completed in 5 years, which is amazing. And when you consider just how much reconstruction was required, it was delivered ahead of time and under budget, which is absolutely unheard of in the construction industry. And in fact, many of the rooms were restored to better than they had been for many, many years beforehand. So it was a wonderful opportunity to get some of the rooms back to how their original magnificence that perhaps may have faded over time. So it was a great opportunity to reinstate the truly magnificent parts of the rooms. So yes, it was all completed back in 1997.
Wonderful. And a reminder for those on the line to go to the link in the chat and vote on your favorite questions. We have 18 in here and we won't get to them all before the end of this session. So do vote on your favorites to make sure we get to those. The next question that people want to hear about is, are there secret passages or hidden rooms in the castle?
There are all over the place. So there are ones in the Charles II room section, the 17th century section. And the reason for that, he wanted to be able to get around the castle without everybody. He wanted privacy. So Charles II had these formal set of rooms with his bed in it, but he actually slept in a bed in a room underneath. So there was a downstairs floor. And the way he would get from one to the other was through secret passages that led down secret stairs. So he would also visit mistresses and things like that as well. So there was a series of secret passageways for him. But much earlier than that, there are two sally ports, they're called. And these date back, I think it's to the 12th century. They're really, really early. And what this was, that if the castle was under siege with forces surrounding it, a sally port was like a secret exit. So troops could escape where no one would see them, surround the forces around the castle and attack them from the back. And one of these sally ports goes from underneath St. George's Chapel, one of the buildings next to it. And it's absolutely amazing thing. It's this big wide staircase, so it accommodates soldiers two at a time, standing side by side. This great big steep flight of steps, and then a tunnel, but the tunnel has been blocked up. We don't know when it was blocked up, and it probably can't be unblocked. But everybody's intrigued to try and work out where it would have come up at the other end. And on the high street in the town of Windsor, just about every shop claims that it would have come up underneath them. That's they all fight about that. So no one's quite resolved it. So yes, full of secret passages, passageways and hidden corners.
Fabulous. Thank you, Susanna, for jumping in here in the last minutes to answer some of those questions. That was our last question. We are just about out of time today. We'll be sure, I see a lot of people saying thank you in the messages. We'll be sure to pass those along to Richard as well, so that he hears the gratitude for his amazing presentation today. Thank you, Windsor Castle, Susanna, Richard, for joining us today. We hope everyone enjoyed spending the evening in the UK as much as we did. As I said, you can sign up for more sessions like this for the rest of the Culture Festival this week, and you can find more inspiration on more ways to experience culture from home and when it's safe again in your area from out and about on the Tiqets blog. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Windsor Castle, Susanna, Richard, We hope to see all of you again soon, and please have a great rest of your evening, your morning, whatever time it is, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.